In a landlocked nation under siege, power flipped faster than anyone expected, as violence spread and institutions bent under pressure. For years, foreign help promised stability, yet attacks intensified, displacement surged, and trust eroded, leaving communities to wonder who truly held control. What does it mean for ordinary lives when Ibrahim Traoré steps forward and redefines who decides security, dignity, and sovereignty in Burkina Faso? A country pauses, recalibrates, and moves toward an uncertain horizon where consequences will reach far beyond its borders. You are about to hear an account that carries weight precisely because it avoids slogans and looks directly at consequences, choices, and trade-offs that many discussions skip. By the end, you will understand how decisions made at the top ripple through security, livelihoods, and regional alignments. This is not background noise. If you stop here, the picture remains incomplete. You would see only fragments, headlines without context, reactions without causes, praise or criticism without the chain that links them together. Missing the chain makes it easy to misunderstand why support emerged, why resistance hardened, and why outside powers reacted the way they did. Staying with the story means following events from promise to pressure, from intention to outcome, and seeing where the risks truly lie rather than where they are assumed to be. What quickly became clear was that the change in leadership did not simply shift rhetoric, it altered the way the crisis was framed and acted upon almost immediately. Within months, areas that had felt permanently abandoned were suddenly described as priorities rather than lost causes. One figure captures the scale of the inherited problem. More than 2 million people had already been displaced by the violence before the transition. A number that alone explains why patience inside the country had run out. The situation did not begin overnight. Years of militant attacks, spreading from border regions into the interior, steadily eroded confidence in the state's ability to protect its citizens. Villages emptied, schools closed, and basic services disappeared from large swathes of territory. As fear spread, so did frustration, especially when foreign military assistance failed to reverse the trend despite its visible presence. For many communities, insecurity felt permanent, and outside help felt distant. This was the environment in which Ibrahim Traoré emerged, presenting himself not as a distant administrator, but as a response to a national emergency. His rise was fueled by a belief that existing strategies had reached a dead end. Supporters argued that repeating the same alliances and the same methods would only reproduce the same results. Critics, meanwhile, warned that abrupt change carried its own dangers, especially in a region already fragile. Ordinary people were the first to feel the tension between hope and risk. Farmers in rural areas wanted protection more than speeches. Urban residents wanted proof that sacrifice would be shared across both groups. There was a sense that the status quo had failed so thoroughly that experimentation felt less frightening than stagnation. This backdrop explains why early decisions were judged not by ideology, but by whether they produced visible movement where there had been none. At this stage of the story, attention shifts from events to guidance, from chaos to who helps interpret it. For many Burkinabe, that role was filled not by foreign advisors or distant institutions, but by the figure now at the center of power and by voices closest to the ground, officers within the security forces, local administrators, and community leaders began describing a noticeable change in tone. Urgency replaced procedure, and outcomes mattered more than appearances. One early signal came from how decisions were communicated. Orders emphasized speed, coordination, and personal responsibility, reflecting a belief that delay itself had become a threat. In security briefings and public remarks, the language focused less on abstract strategy and more on immediate protection of towns, roads, and supply routes. This framing mattered, because it gave people a sense that someone was reading the map from inside the crisis rather than from afar. A second signal was repetition. Similar messages emerged from different regions, suggesting this was not an isolated experiment. Local officials spoke of tighter links with central command. Civilians described seeing state presence return, even if unevenly, to places long considered beyond reach. These were not yet victories, but they were indicators that direction had changed. Still, guidance does not guarantee success. Critics caution that momentum can fade, and that leadership under pressure risks oversimplifying complex conflicts. Yet even skeptics acknowledged one point: the story had crossed the threshold. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether change was coming, but whether it would be strong enough and disciplined enough to alter the course of a long and costly crisis. The sequence of events accelerated once decisions moved from statements to action, and the shift could be felt almost immediately on the ground. The trigger came when security policy stopped revolving around containment and began aiming at prisons. Areas once treated as peripheral were pulled back into the center of planning, and that alone altered expectations. Roads long avoided reopened under escort. Convoys resumed. The sense that nothing ever changed started to crack. Pressure then mounted quickly. Recruitment drives expanded the pool of forces, drawing civilians into auxiliary roles and reframing the conflict as a collective struggle rather than a distant military campaign. Training was brief, equipment basic, but the message was unmistakable. Waiting for perfect conditions was no longer acceptable. Communities that had watched attacks from the sidelines were now part of the response, for better or worse. Support surged alongside anxiety, because empowerment also carried risk. As operations intensified, reactions multiplied. Militant groups adapted, testing defenses and probing weak points. Casualties followed, including among volunteers, underscoring the cost of speed. At the same time, reports emerged of towns partially relieved from blockades, markets reopening under protection, and humanitarian access improving in pockets where it had been cut off for months. Each gain was fragile, but each reinforced the sense that movement had replaced paralysis. The aftershocks sprayed beyond the battlefield. Diplomatic signals grew sharper as alliances were questioned and old partnerships reassessed. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership style became inseparable from this momentum, praised by supporters as decisive and criticized by others as dangerously compressed. International observers debated whether the pace itself could destabilize institutions already under strain. What lingered most was the psychological residue. Fear had not vanished, yet resignation weakened. People spoke less about abandonment and more about uncertainty, which marked a subtle but important change. The timeline did not deliver resolution, only acceleration. But it made one fact unavoidable: the country had entered a phase where consequences, not intentions, would determine whether this gamble reshaped the conflict or deepened its costs. Before drawing conclusions, it helps to slow the pace and look at what the numbers say when emotion is stripped away. This is the point where impressions meet measurement, and where claims about momentum either hold or collapse under weight. The baseline inherited by the current leadership was severe. Violence had already displaced more than 2 million people nationwide, and roughly 40% of national territory was assessed as outside effective state control at the peak of the crisis. Those figures define the starting line, not the outcome. The first measurable shift appeared in force composition. Within months, the security apparatus expanded sharply through the recruitment of civilian auxiliaries. Tens of thousands of applicants came forward, with about 50,000 eventually enrolled as volunteers for territorial defense. The number matters not only because of scale, but because it changed coverage density. Areas that previously waited days or weeks for response now had some form of armed presence within hours. In practical terms, that altered how often convoys moved, how frequently markets reopened, and how quickly alerts traveled from village to command posts. A second data point reflects tempo. Under previous arrangements, large portions of the country saw minimal operational change year to year. After the transition, reports tracked a noticeable increase in joint patrols and coordinated actions across multiple regions within a single quarter. The shift from sporadic engagement to continuous pressure reduced the predictability militants relied on. Analysts noted that attacks did not disappear, but their pattern became less concentrated in certain corridors, suggesting adaptation on both sides. Human impact provides the third and most sensitive measure. In zones where blockades were partially lifted, humanitarian deliveries resumed and limited returns of displaced families were recorded. Even small movements mattered. A few thousand people returning to farmland or reopening schools does not reverse a national emergency, but it signals a directional change. For communities that had known only contraction, any expansion felt significant. These figures do not tell a simple success story. Casualty reports among volunteers rose alongside deployment, highlighting the cost of rapid mobilization. Rights groups flagged incidents that demanded investigation, warning that scale without discipline can generate new harm. Supporters of Ibrahim Traoré countered that delay had already proven deadly, and that imperfect action was preferable to paralysis. What the numbers ultimately show is weight, not verdict. They indicate that the situation moved from static decline to dynamic risk. Whether that risk matures into stability or spirals into further fragmentation depends on how these quantitative gains are managed over time, and whether speed can be matched with control. Any serious assessment has to pause here and acknowledge that strong opposition to this approach exists, and not all of it is superficial. One line of criticism argues that rapid militarization and the arming of civilians risk deepening violence rather than resolving it. From this perspective, expanding auxiliary forces so quickly may blur the line between defense and vigilantism, especially in areas where ethnic tensions already run high. Critics contend that short training cycles and uneven oversight make abuses more likely, which in turn could fuel militant recruitment instead of suppressing it. That argument gains strength from a regional precedent. In parts of the Sahel, poorly controlled militias have previously committed reprisals that hardened communal divisions. Human rights organizations warn that once trust is broken at the local level, restoring it can take generations. They also know that international isolation, triggered by controversial security policies, may reduce access to intelligence, funding, and humanitarian support, ultimately weakening the state's capacity rather than strengthening it. A second opposing view focuses on governance. Skeptics argue that concentrating authority and accelerating decision-making under emergency logic can sideline civilian institutions. Even if short-term gains are achieved, they warn that long-term stability requires accountable systems, not just decisive leadership. From this angle, Ibrahim Traoré's emphasis on urgency may solve immediate problems while storing up political ones, particularly if timelines for normalization remain unclear. Supporters respond by grounding their rebuttal in conditions on the ground. They point out that before the shift in strategy, many communities had effectively been abandoned, left to negotiate survival on their own. In that context, the absence of state protection already carried severe human costs. The choice, they argue, was not between perfect order and risky action, but between continued collapse and an attempt to regain initiative. They also note that disciplinary frameworks and command structures were formally extended to auxiliary forces, precisely to limit abuse. When these positions are placed side by side, a clearer picture emerges. The debate is not about whether risks exist, but about which risks are tolerable in a crisis of this scale. One side prioritizes restraint to prevent future damage. The other prioritizes momentum to stop present harm. Understanding this tension is essential because it defines the narrow path the country is now walking, where either excess or hesitation could undermine the very stability everyone claims to seek. Everything shifted at once. The turning point was not a single battle or decree, but a strategic break that redefined who Burkina Faso would rely on when survival was at stake. As foreign military partnerships were terminated and long-standing agreements dissolved, the country crossed a line that many observers believed it would never cross. The withdrawal of external forces signaled that security would no longer be outsourced, even if that meant standing alone in the short term. For supporters, this was the moment intention became irreversible. Ibrahim Traoré framed the decision as a reclaiming of agency, arguing that years of external assistance had failed to stop the bloodshed and had instead diluted responsibility. Ending those arrangements forced institutions, soldiers, and civilians to confront the reality that success or failure would now be internal, visible, and owned. The impact went beyond logistics. Psychologically, it altered expectations inside the ranks and among the public. Some felt exposed, fearing the loss of intelligence and air support. Others felt clarity for the first time, believing that ambiguity about who was in charge had quietly undermined past efforts. Internationally, reactions hardened. Allies expressed concern. Rivals sensed opportunity, and analysts began reassessing Burkina Faso's trajectory within a shifting global order. What mattered most was that the story had entered a deeper layer. From this point forward, the question was no longer whether change was possible, but what kind of change this decisive separation would unlock and what price would be paid before its consequences fully surfaced. From that strategic break, consequences moved quickly from conference rooms into daily life, where their weight became impossible to ignore. What had looked like a geopolitical choice soon revealed itself as a set of concrete pressures and opportunities touching every layer of society. The effects were uneven, but they were real, and they clarified who carried the cost first. For the state, the immediate impact was pressure on governance and credibility. Security decisions could no longer be deferred to partners, which forced faster internal coordination and sharper accountability. Ministries faced the strain of funding expanded operations while absorbing diplomatic fallout. Ibrahim Traoré's administration gained latitude to act decisively, but it also inherited full responsibility for outcomes. Each success reinforced legitimacy, while each failure landed squarely on domestic institutions, leaving little room to deflect blame. Businesses felt the shift through risk and recalibration. Supply chains in insecure regions became fragile but not frozen. Transport corridors reopened sporadically under protection, allowing trade to resume in pockets. At the same time, uncertainty around sanctions, aid suspensions, and changing alliances affected investment sentiment. Some firms paused expansion plans, while others adapted by localizing operations and relying more heavily on regional partners. The economic picture became less predictable, but also less dependent on distant guarantees. For ordinary people, the consequences were most tangible. In rural areas, security presence meant markets reopening, schools tentatively resuming, and humanitarian convoys reaching places long cut off. These gains were fragile and often temporary, but they changed daily calculations. Urban residents felt the impact through prices, employment anxiety, and constant news of the front lines. Support for Ibrahim Traoré remained tied not to ideology, but to whether life felt marginally safer or less abandoned than before. Regionally, the ripple effects widened. Neighboring states watched closely as Burkina Faso asserted more independent posture, recalibrating their own positions in response. Cooperation intensified with some partners, while relations cooled with others, contributing to a broader realignment across the Sahel. Security dynamics no longer stopped at borders, and the sense of shared fate among certain governments deepened. Taken together, these outcomes showed that the decision was not symbolic. It redistributed risk across institutions, markets, households, and alliances. No group remained untouched. The consequences were uneven, contested, and still unfolding. But they confirmed one thing: the country had crossed into a phase where choices produced immediate, visible effects, binding leadership and society together in a single, high-stakes trajectory. The most likely path forward is neither collapse nor breakthrough, but sustained strain managed through adaptation. Security operations continue at high tempo, with incremental gains offset by periodic setbacks. Governance remains centralized and urgent, producing stability in some areas while leaving others exposed. Daily life improves unevenly, enough to sustain cautious support without delivering relief that feels decisive. A more optimistic scenario depends on consolidation. Discipline improves within expanded forces, abuses are contained, and coordination deepens with select regional partners. Gradual security gains allow displaced families to return in larger numbers, while economic activity stabilizes around reopened corridors. In this version, Ibrahim Traoré's gamble yields credibility and time, creating space for institutional rebuilding rather than permanent emergency. The worst case emerges if pressure overwhelms control, rapid militarization fractures locally, abuses multiply, and the insecurity mutates rather than recedes. International isolation deepens, shrinking resources just as demands grow. Public patience thins, not from ideology, but exhaustion. and the system enters a cycle where force sustains itself without delivering safety. What matters is not predicting which scenario wins, but recognizing that all three remain plausible. The direction will be set less by declarations than by execution, restraint, and learning speed. In a crisis this compressed, small decisions compound quickly, and preparedness lies in understanding the full range of outcomes rather than betting on only one. After following the wider picture and the possible futures, the focus narrows to the person watching and listening, because these shifts do not stay abstract for long. They filter into decisions, expectations, and the sense of control people feel over their own lives. The question becomes simple and personal. Where do you stand inside a story like this? And how exposed are you to its direction? For those who actively follow regional affairs and security trends, the changes bring both advantage and burden. Understanding the context offers foresight, but it also demands constant recalibration as events move quickly. Staying informed becomes a form of preparation, helping to distinguish temporary turbulence from structural change and reducing the risk of reacting too late to signals that matter. A second group feels the effects indirectly. Their work, prices they pay, or stability they rely on shift in response to decisions made far away. Even without deep engagement, uncertainty seeps into planning. Jobs feel less predictable, costs fluctuate, and long-term assumptions weaken. For them, awareness is less about analysis and more about adjusting expectations before pressure becomes personal. There are also those who believe the story does not concern them at all. Distance can feel protective, but it carries its own risk in a connected world. Shocks rarely stay contained. Ignoring underlying dynamics often means encountering their consequences without warning, when choices are already limited and response is more costly. Across these groups, one truth holds. Understanding does not remove risk, but it restores agency. Knowing how and why events unfold allows individuals to anticipate rather than simply absorb change. In that sense, following this story is not an exercise in anxiety, but a way to remain positioned rather than passive as outcomes continue to take shape. Solutions cannot remain rhetorical when pressure is this high, because slogans do not secure roads, feed families, or restore trust. The next phase depends on whether action can be structured, measured, and corrected in real time rather than announced once and left to drift. That begins with leadership choices that translate urgency into discipline. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the central task at the state level is to tighten command, clarify rules of engagement, and enforce accountability timelines that are visible, not implied. Progress is measured through fewer unresolved incidents, faster response coordination, and transparent follow-up when violations occur. The second layer sits with institutions and partners that operate the system day to day. Security units, local administrations, and humanitarian channels need synchronized planning windows rather than parallel efforts. Practical indicators here include stabilized supply routes, predictable convoy schedules, and consistent access to essential services in reopened areas. When coordination improves, volatility decreases, even if threats remain. The third layer belongs to communities and individuals. Participation must move from symbolic support to defined roles that reduce harm. Clear reporting channels, civilian protection mechanisms, and basic training standards give people a way to contribute without amplifying risk. Success is visible when cooperation replaces fear, and when communities choose engagement over flight. A fourth step, where feasible, involves selective regional cooperation. Information sharing and logistical alignment with neighboring states facing similar threats can reduce duplication and blind spots. This is measured not by declarations, but by joint operations that close gaps militants exploit. Ultimately, execution is the deciding factor. Plans only matter when they produce repeatable outcomes. The future turns on whether these steps remain adaptive, correcting failure quickly, and whether urgency is matched by control rather than consumed by it. The story circles back to the moment when guidance first replaced drift, when urgency became the dominant language and hesitation lost legitimacy. The same voices that described that early shift now look back with a mix of pride and caution, aware of how far the path has stretched since then, What began as a response to emergency has grown into a defining chapter. From the initial rupture through escalation and consequence, the journey has been marked by compression. Events that might have taken years elsewhere unfolded in months. Decisions carried weight immediately. For supporters, this confirmed that Ibrahim Traoré embodied a break with repetition and resignation. For critics, it reinforced the fear that speed itself could become a liability. Both sides, however, recognized that the country did not stand still. Beyond policy and alliances, the deeper meaning rests with people who lived through contraction and now measure change in small signals. A reopened market, a guarded road, a school that functions again, even briefly. These moments do not erase loss, but they anchor hope in something tangible rather than abstract promise. What remains unresolved is not whether the gamble was bold, but whether it can mature. Crisis can forge resolve, yet only balance can sustain it. The closing truth is simple and heavy. This is no longer only a story about leadership or geopolitics. It is about endurance, judgment, and the cost of choosing movement over paralysis. The future will not be decided by rhetoric, but by whether resolve hardens into stability or fractures under its own momentum. After moving through pressure, consequence, and possibility, it is worth pausing on what this story invites rather than demands. Different people will draw different conclusions, shaped by experience, values, and proximity to risk. That diversity of interpretation is not a weakness. It is how complex realities are understood without being reduced to slogans. If you believe this account adds clarity, it may be worth letting others encounter the same context before forming their own views. Not to persuade, but to widen the space for informed discussion, especially in moments when the reactions often outrun understanding. Shared awareness is one way communities avoid being pulled apart by partial narratives. This story also opens a quiet conversation, not about heroes or villains, but about thresholds. How much uncertainty is acceptable? How much urgency justifies risk? Where responsibility should sit when choices affect millions? These are questions without easy answers, yet they gain meaning when more voices engage with them seriously. So consider this an open door rather than a conclusion. Reflection does not end with the last sentence, and neither does the story itself. As events continue to unfold, understanding grows through dialogue, not silence. In your view, which choice made so far carries the greatest long-term consequence? And why do you think it matters most now?